Breaking. The Supreme Court just delivered a unanimous 9-0 ruling that will force Keir Starmer from power within the next 72 hours. 9 judges, 0 dissent, one devastating conclusion. The Prime Minister violated constitutional law. And what happened in that courtroom at 10:47 this morning will be studied for the next 100 years as the moment British democracy saved itself from tyranny. If you want to see how this constitutional earthquake ends, hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about British politics. Here's what sparked the constitutional crisis that just destroyed Keir Starmer's career. 3 weeks ago, Labour pushed through the Emergency Powers Act using a parliamentary procedure that hadn't been used in 80 years. The bill granted the Prime Minister unprecedented authority to bypass Parliament on immigration, energy policy, and public safety. Starmer's words were chilling. Sometimes democracy requires decisive action without endless debate. But a coalition of Conservative MPs, Reform UK leaders, and even 12 Labour backbenchers weren't staying silent. They filed an emergency constitutional challenge instead. And this morning, in a packed courtroom at the Royal Courts of Justice, 9 Supreme Court justices delivered a judgment so devastating that constitutional lawyers are calling it the most significant ruling since the Magna Carta. At exactly 10:47 a.m., Lady Chief Justice Eleanor Thornton began reading the unanimous decision. Her voice was calm, measured, but every word landed like a hammer blow. The Prime Minister's use of emergency powers, she stated, looking directly at the government's legal team, constitutes a fundamental breach of parliamentary sovereignty and violates the constitutional settlement established over centuries of British democratic tradition. The courtroom erupted. Government lawyers sat frozen. Opposition MPs in the gallery couldn't contain their shock. One senior barrister later described it as the most brutal judicial takedown of executive overreach in living memory. But the Chief Justice wasn't finished. She continued for another 6 minutes, systematically dismantling every legal argument the government had presented. The ruling cited precedent dating back to 1688. It referenced the Bill of Rights. It quoted Magna Carta itself. And then came the final devastating blow. This court hereby declares the Emergency Powers Act void and demands the immediate reversal of all actions taken under its authority. Within seconds, the news flashed across every screen in Britain. Within minutes, constitutional chaos had begun. Meanwhile, British citizens who voted for democratic accountability are watching their Prime Minister ignore the highest court in the land. James Patterson, a 64-year-old former soldier from Yorkshire, told reporters outside Parliament, "I fought for this country, I fought for the rule of law, and now I'm watching a Prime Minister who thinks he's above the law itself." His voice cracked with emotion as he described feeling betrayed by the very government he'd trusted to protect British values. Across the country, millions share his outrage. Working families who play by the rules, pay their taxes, and respect the law are watching elites in Westminster decide that laws only apply to ordinary people. While Starmer and his inner circle enjoy the protection of parliamentary privilege and taxpayer-funded security, everyday Britons who challenge government overreach face the full force of state power. We're talking about a Prime Minister who spent his career as a lawyer, who knows exactly what the law requires, deliberately choosing to ignore a Supreme Court ruling. The contrast is so staggering, so fundamentally un-British, that even lifelong Labour voters are demanding Starmer's immediate resignation. Think about the pensioners who spent decades contributing to this country, who raised families on British values of fairness and justice, now watching their Prime Minister treat the Supreme Court like an inconvenient obstacle to be bulldozed. Think about the small business owners barely surviving under Labour's tax increases, who get prosecuted for the smallest regulatory violation, watching the most powerful man in Britain ignore the highest court with impunity. The sense of betrayal runs deeper than politics. This strikes at the very heart of what it means to be British. Then something unprecedented happened that nobody saw coming. King Charles broke 70 years of constitutional precedent with a private intervention that will define his reign forever. At precisely 2:15 p.m., less than 4 hours after the Supreme Court ruling, the King requested an emergency audience with the Prime Minister at Buckingham Palace. Palace sources described the meeting as extraordinarily tense and unlike anything in modern royal history. According to senior courtiers who spoke on condition of anonymity, Charles didn't mince words. "Prime Minister, the king reportedly said with barely contained fury. The Supreme Court has spoken with one voice. 9 justices, unanimous verdict, clear constitutional requirement. What is your intention? Starmer's response, leaked by someone in that room, was equally shocking. Your Majesty, with respect, the court doesn't understand the pressures of modern governance. I intend to seek alternative legal opinions. The temperature in the room reportedly dropped instantly. Charles, a man who has spent his entire life respecting constitutional boundaries, stood and delivered words that insiders say were spoken with steel in his voice. Then I must remind the Prime Minister that in this constitutional monarchy, the Crown defends the law, always, without exception. And if you will not respect the highest court's ruling, you leave me no choice but to consider my own constitutional obligations. Palace insiders reveal that Charles spent the previous night consulting with constitutional experts, former prime ministers, and senior judges. He knew this moment was coming. He prepared for it. And when Starmer tried to dismiss the Supreme Court's authority, the king activated contingency plans that haven't been touched since the abdication crisis of 1936. The optics are absolutely devastating for Starmer. The monarch, traditionally silent on political matters, has effectively declared that the Prime Minister's position is constitutionally untenable. But here's what makes this even more explosive. Sources inside the palace reveal that Charles didn't act alone. Before that confrontation with Starmer, the king held a secret conference call with the former prime ministers still living: Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, and Liz Truss. Every single one of them, regardless of party loyalty, advised Charles that Starmer's defiance of the Supreme Court represented an existential threat to British democracy. Blair, who spent a decade navigating constitutional waters, reportedly told the king, "Your Majesty, if a Prime Minister can ignore the Supreme Court today, then tomorrow no institution is safe. Not Parliament, not the courts, not even the Crown itself." That's when Charles understood this wasn't about politics anymore. This was about whether Britain would remain a nation governed by law or descend into executive dictatorship. The weight of history pressed down on his shoulders. Every monarch since the Glorious Revolution has understood their sacred duty: defend the Constitution, protect the law, preserve democracy. And now, at 76 years old, after waiting his entire life to wear the crown, Charles faces the most consequential decision any British monarch has confronted in 3 centuries. Does he stay silent and watch constitutional order collapse, or does he act and risk accusations of royal interference that could fuel Republican movements for decades? The king chose principle over popularity, and that choice may have just saved Britain from sliding toward authoritarianism. The financial markets responded with immediate panic. By 3:30 p.m., the pound had fallen 4.2% against the dollar, the steepest single-day drop since Brexit. Investment firms began pulling £1.8 billion from British assets. The FTSE 100 crashed 380 points in 90 minutes. Currency traders in London described absolute carnage as international investors fled what they now viewed as constitutional instability. Goldman Sachs released an emergency briefing warning clients that Britain faced a governance crisis of unprecedented severity. But the economic chaos was just the beginning. Inside the Labour Party, the fractures became seismic splits. Shadow cabinet members who'd stood loyally beside Starmer for years suddenly discovered urgent constituency matters requiring their immediate attention. David Lammy refused all interview requests. Bridget Phillipson cancelled scheduled appearances. Wes Streeting, normally Starmer's most vocal defender, posted a single cryptic tweet: "The law must be respected. No exceptions." His silence on defending the Prime Minister spoke volumes. By 5 p.m., the hashtag number Starmer must go was trending #1 globally with over 2.3 million tweets. Protests erupted simultaneously in Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Glasgow. In Bristol, an estimated 15,000 people filled the city centre demanding Starmer's resignation. The BBC's political editor described the party as in complete freefall with no clear path to stability. And still, Starmer remained defiant, holed up in Downing Street, reportedly screaming at advisers that the court was wrong and he was right. Inside number 10, the atmosphere has devolved into something between panic and civil war. Senior civil servants are openly discussing whether they have a constitutional duty to disobey the Prime Minister's orders. The Cabinet Secretary held an emergency meeting with permanent secretaries across Whitehall, reportedly warning them that following Starmer's directives could make them personally liable for contempt of court. Ministers are plotting in corridors, holding whispered conversations behind closed doors, desperately calculating whether their careers survive if they stay loyal or jump ship. Angela Rayner was spotted entering Rachel Reeves' office at 4:47 p.m. for what one observer called definitely not a social visit. The two women emerged 90 minutes later, stone-faced, refusing to answer reporters' questions. WhatsApp groups with names like Constitutional Crisis Response and Post-Starmer Planning are buzzing with activity. One leaked message from a cabinet minister simply read, "He's finished. The only question is whether he takes us all down with him." The chief whip has reportedly lost count of how many MPs are threatening to withdraw confidence. The 1,922 Committee of Backbench Conservatives is preparing a no-confidence motion that could come as early as tomorrow. Labour's own backbenchers are in open revolt, with 34 MPs signing a letter demanding Starmer respect the court ruling immediately. Downing Street staffers described the Prime Minister as unrecognisable, alternating between rage and paranoid suspicion about who's leaking against him. One aide was overheard saying he looked like a man who knows the walls are closing in, but refuses to accept reality. But wait, because there's another layer to this disaster that nobody's talking about yet. While Starmer fights for his political survival, the actual governance of Britain has ground to a complete halt. The Emergency Powers Act that the Supreme Court just voided was used to implement 47 separate policy directives over the past 3 weeks. Every single one of those directives is now legally invalid. Immigration detention orders issued under the Act? Invalid. Energy sector regulations? Invalid. Public safety measures? Invalid. We're talking about a legal black hole where 3 weeks of government action has been retroactively erased from existence. Civil servants are frantically trying to determine which decisions can be salvaged and which ones expose the government to billions in legal liability. One senior Mandarin anonymously told The Telegraph, "It's like someone pulled the foundation out from under a building. Everything collapses. Businesses that complied with now invalid regulations are demanding compensation. Individuals detained under now void immigration orders are filing lawsuits. Local councils that implemented the directives are threatening to sue the government for forcing them to break the law. The legal chaos will take years to untangle and cost taxpayers hundreds of millions. And every penny of that cost traces back to Keir Starmer's arrogant refusal to listen to his own lawyers 3 weeks ago. But here's the part that could trigger the biggest constitutional crisis in 300 years. Leaked legal memos from the Attorney General's office reveal that government lawyers warned Starmer 2 weeks before pushing the Emergency Powers Act that it would likely fail constitutional scrutiny. The documents, obtained by The Times and verified by 3 separate sources, show explicit advice, stating, "The proposed legislation exceeds executive authority and will almost certainly be struck down by the Supreme Court." If these documents are accurate, and if they show what multiple legal experts claim they show, then Starmer didn't just make a legal mistake. He deliberately ignored his own lawyers, pushed unconstitutional legislation through Parliament knowing it was illegal, and then defied the Supreme Court when they called him on it. Think about what that means. A Prime Minister who campaigned on restoring trust and integrity, who promised to respect institutions and the rule of law, deliberately breaking constitutional law while knowing exactly what he was doing. The optics of that would be absolutely devastating. It transforms this from a legal dispute into willful contempt of the Constitution itself. It's the difference between an error and a calculated assault on British democracy. And if the public discovers their Prime Minister knew all along that he was violating constitutional law, the backlash won't just destroy Starmer's career. It will obliterate Labour's credibility for a generation. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak is executing the political opportunity of his career with surgical precision. While Starmer rages against judges and fights with the King, Sunak stood before cameras at Conservative headquarters, radiating calm authority. "The law is clear," he stated with quiet confidence. "The Supreme Court has spoken, and in Britain, we respect the law, always. No personal attacks, no political point scoring, just steady defense of constitutional order." He then pivoted brilliantly. "The Conservative Party stands ready to restore stable government, respect for institutions, and leadership that puts country before ego. The contrast couldn't be more stark. Starmer looks increasingly unhinged, isolated, defiant of the law itself. Sunak looks prime ministerial, principled, exactly like what Britain needs after this chaos. The polls reflect a political earthquake. The latest YouGov survey shows Conservatives surging to 38%, Labour collapsing to 24%, and Reform UK steady at 18%. For the first time since the general election, Tories have a commanding 14-point lead. In Labour strongholds across the north, support has cratered by staggering margins. Newcastle, Liverpool, Manchester constituencies that haven't voted Conservative in decades are now showing Tory leads. Focus groups reveal brutal findings. Even Labour loyalists describe Starmer as dangerous, dictatorial, and disrespecting everything British. Bookmakers now give Sunak 3-1 odds of being Prime Minister again within 3 months. Farage, ever the tactician, is positioning Reform UK not as opposition but as kingmakers in whatever coalition emerges from this wreckage. The next 48 hours will determine whether Britain survives this crisis intact or descends into constitutional chaos unseen since the English Civil War. Tomorrow morning, the Supreme Court reconvenes to consider contempt of court charges against the Prime Minister personally. Legal scholars say if Starmer continues defying the ruling, the justices could issue an unprecedented order compelling his removal from office. The King has scheduled another meeting with constitutional advisers, fueling speculation he's preparing to exercise royal prerogative powers that haven't been used in living memory. Could Charles actually dismiss a Prime Minister? Constitutional experts say technically yes, if the PM refuses to respect court rulings and Parliament. But using that power would trigger a political firestorm that makes today's chaos look like a garden party. Meanwhile, Labour MPs are scheduled for an emergency parliamentary party meeting at 7 p.m. tonight. And sources say it's going to be absolutely brutal. The question isn't whether Starmer survives. The question is whether he resigns tonight or gets forced out tomorrow. Britain is watching the slow-motion collapse of a government in real time. This constitutional crisis will be studied for decades as the moment a Prime Minister's ego clashed with 800 years of British democratic tradition and lost catastrophically. At its epicenter stands Keir Starmer, who looks increasingly isolated, increasingly desperate, and increasingly finished. So here's the question that matters. Does Starmer resign tonight to save his dignity, or does he force the King to remove him tomorrow? Did he just commit the greatest act of political self-destruction in modern British history? Or is there some desperate legal maneuver he's planning that we haven't seen yet? What do you think happens in the next 24 hours? Does Labour force him out? Does Charles act first? Or does the Supreme Court drop the hammer? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this constitutional earthquake shocked you as much as it shocked us, share it with everyone who needs to see what's really happening in Westminster right now. The mainstream media is still trying to spin this as a legal technicality, but we're giving you the truth. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because tomorrow's developments are going to be even more explosive. This is the biggest political crisis in modern British history, and you're watching it unfold in real time.